Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm Matthew, and I'm joined yet again by Eric, and today we're going to be talking about, we're going to get started with our description of the archetypes. We're going to be going over what we consider the three main archetypes of cEDH, that being mid-range stacks, and today's topic, which is going to be Turbo.
Virtually unplayable Turbo. No, I'm just playing.
Virtually unplayable. Not doing that great in the tournaments nowadays, but that's how the meta is. And it's still, even with that being the case, one of the most popular archetypes. And it's kind of like the defining thing. Like when a lot of people think of cEDH, they're thinking Turbo ad nauseum. And that's what we're going to talk about. Sort of the perks of playing it if you're new, some things to look out for, some of the popular decks, and what's good with it, what you can expect, and
So you mentioned something right there about the tournament meta scene. So without, going down the rabbit hole, I will say it's really fascinating because if all these other decks are preparing to try to fight against Turbo, and when we talk about Turbo, we'll get into the specifics of it. It's going to become, parasitic eventually to where the mid-range decks are all just kind of like butting up against each other, and there's like nobody able to like pull the trigger to win. So it's gonna change gameplay, and then basically the mid-range decks will evolve, and then maybe the true stacks decks will evolve. And then they'll be like, all right, Turbo's not really a thing anymore. We got to do our game plan. And then Turbo comes right back in and does its thing. And then the cycle starts all over. It's a rock, paper, scissors style of format. And then there's obviously a lot of deviations in the list that we'll talk about today in terms of what true Turbo is versus something like a Storm, or, kind of like square and a rectangle. One can be one, but the other can't be the other. So we'll get into that.
Yeah, it's definitely throughout. I mean, by the time, even, if you're watching this maybe in like a few months, we might be back into like a full Turbo Nas meta where everybody's just trying to win turn two. But
perfectly balanced, like all things should be.
Yeah, there's definitely, as you'll find these, I don't like to think of the archetypes as like a rock, paper, scissors, where it's just like, oh, this is going to win the pod because it's more this or this. But you'll definitely see what's considered to be favorable and into certain metas shift over time. I guess first we'll sort of set out the way we would define Turbo. There can be a little bit of an argument about whether a deck is or isn't Turbo, depending on some card selection. Typically, though, it's going to be really defined by the presence of the card ad nauseum, which sort of rewards everything that a lot of fast decks want to do. You get to draw a lot of cards because your mana costs are low, because you want to have really efficient cards, because you're trying to go fast. You're not trying to make 4 or 5 land drops. You're trying to get, accelerated out early in the game, pump out a bunch of mana with cards like Dark Ritual, Rite of Flame, these ritual effects that let you trade out card advantage because you're going to be spending cards to make mana. But the trade-off is these huge payoffs with cards like Ad Nauseam and Peer into the Abyss, which when they resolve, get to just draw you most of your deck and let you typically storm off, playing out your Lotus Petals and your Mox Ambers and all these other cards, redeploy your mana, rebuild with all of these cards you have, and then win with Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Reach.
Yeah, so that was a really great way to just kind of package everything together, especially when it involves Turbo, because there's so many decks that try to Turbo out, like whether it's like a commander or just the resources in general, but that doesn't inherently define them as a Turbo deck. Virtually every deck has some form of fast mana. So I don't like when people Turbo decks, you're going to see this. You're probably going to see Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox, Lotus Petal, Soul Ring, and virtually almost every deck, even the stacks decks, if they can play a turn 1 collector oof off of something to basically slow everybody down, that's what they're gonna take that. They're gonna try to utilize that fast mana for that. So the fast mana is kind of like one of these ambiguous things that's in almost every deck. Maybe give or take a mana vault here and there. Again, Dark Ritual is like one of those cards. It's almost in, I think, pretty close to a very universal card in all black decks, but Culling the Weak isn't. So a card like Culling the Weak or Infernal Plunge or an Offering, those type of cards help really define what turbo is, or even a deck that might be abusing Dockside Extortionist repeatedly, whether that's a bounce spell or even reanimation effects where they're looping Dockside with something like a Corpse Dance per se. So that right there really kind of shows you what Turbo's trying to do. They're not only trying to press in with those type of cards, but they're trying to overwhelm the board early on before people get all their resources, their Ristic Studies, and their Mystic Remoras all set up.
Yeah, there's definitely cards that can cross over, especially like Dockside, as you mentioned. There are decks all across the spectrum of proactive and reactive and mid range and stacks that are all using Dockside because a lot of times the broken stuff is broken. It doesn't really matter how you're doing it.
That's CDH.
Yeah, that's just
So
how it is. Good stuff is good, turns out. But yeah, we definitely have like even within so like stacks, for instance, there are decks that can be referred to as like turbo stacks. So a lot of times people might define like Winota as a turbo stack because it's able to do something like an Ornithopter into like land Jeweled Lotus, get out Winota, and you're getting those triggers out immediately. A lot of times you're getting out multiple stacks pieces at the same rate that you might expect a turbo deck, like a turbo ad nauseum deck, to develop their resources to be able to try to win, where they're trying to cast multiple spells. And you'll see, those sort of decks do well, like Winota, because they're able to keep up at like all of the rates. Being able to deploy stacks pieces really quickly is really good just in general. And keeping up with the turbo decks and keeping them in check can be a really big thing. And like you said, the fast mana, especially like the Mana Crypt and the Mox Diamonds, where they become more ubiquitous, is because they stick around. It makes it you're not really going down in card advantage, right? If you do Forest, Mana Crypt, Collector Oof, one, you're just dominated that table. They're all very upset. But also, that Mana Crypt's going to stick around. If your Oof gets removed, you didn't go down a card for it. You're going to have mana that's sticking around. Whereas, like you said, if you do a Culling the Weak into a spell, you're going down potentially as much as like 3 cards to do something. You had to play that creature, you had to sacrifice it, and then you're playing a third spell. That gets countered. You can get kind of screwed, but that's the risk reward that these decks are trying to utilize, because the payoff of getting 5 mana on turn 1 or 2 is just massive when you have spells like Ad Nauseum, or even something as like resource driven cards like Ristic Study and Mystic Remora, and being able to just like Rite of Flame, Mox Diamond, Ristic Study turn 1 can also be just massive in a game of cEDH.
yeah, or just playing like their commanders that also generate a ton of advantage, like a Crom, a Timna, getting those type of cards out as early as turn 1. I mean, I've played, if you've ever played against Crom, you've probably played against a turn 1 Crom a few times. Just off the sheer power of something like a Jeweled Lotus. And, Jeweled Lotus inherently, like, while it can be in tons of commander decks because of the ability to provide those resources, but it only plays deeper into that turbo aspect. So playing against like a turn 3 Crom versus a turn 1 Crom is night and day difference, and or even turn 2 Crom. And I guess what I wanted to piggyback off that was really like Roger, as everybody like so affectionately calls him, is Rograk. So we got Rograk. So Rograk, I think, really helps define what a true turbo deck is. And there's different flavors of it, like we've already just discussed at the ad nauseum, the red black X strategies or Grixis strategies. But even something as simple as like that flavor of Mardu with Roger with Hymna, that's a lot more turbo-y than a traditional Mad Farm list, or even like the polymorph teamer variants that while they have a lot of the traditional like counter spells that we see, the Force of Wills and those types of cards, that deck is trying to get a polymorph effect as early as possible with protection, because that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to put that threat on the battlefield to basically lock everybody out, whether it's something like a Tide Spell Tyrant or Hullbreaker Horror, and then they just go through which way they want to try to win with like a loop or something like that. And we've even seen Roger in other forms of turbo, like turbo stacks, like the Rograk Tevish list that again uses a polymorph effect to turbo out essentially like these big stacks creatures like Void Winter or Sire of Insanity. So turbo is such a unique term because for a new player, it could be very, very When they hear turbo, they might just think dark ritual ad nauseum. But in reality, there's different variations of turbo that we just discussed that are all very different, yet they're still utilizing the same resources, but the end goal is very much different. They could be trying to cast ad nauseum, they could be trying to power out a Hullbreaker Horror, or they could be trying to power out a Sire of Insanity or Winona doing its thing, getting free resources.
I said specifically, Rograk or Roger. If you're new, can be really confusing to see like a deck like Rog Silas and understand like what it does, what it offers, because we're used to like, if you're coming into CDH, you see like these value engines in the command zone, or like cards like Corval that are just like you just read the card, you know it's broken if it comes into play. It's just doing so much. And then you've got Roger who does nothing, on the surface, but it enables it's really, and Rebel has a really good video about this. It just recently came out as the time of this recording, at least, about what Rograk specifically enables, and that's raw mana efficiency and mana cheat, and being able to use those sort of effects. So like if you have Rograk, Culling the Weak being just immediately available, makes that card so much more consistent and just gives you
Mhm.
access to so much mana. Your deflecting slots, your fierce guardian ships, they're online immediately. That's like 3 or 4 mana cheat. And just in general, the goal of Turbo, whether it's in a stacks environment or like in a ad nauseum list, is to get underneath your opponents. So being able to do your game plan before your opponents are able to enact theirs. And when you have a commander like Rograk that just gives you free mana or resources, that really can help you get that ball moving a lot quicker than your opponents are able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great way to say it. So, what would you think that for a new player coming in, they're like, okay, cool. I want to get into turbo. What's the next step? What do I need to learn next?
Pretty good question. So I think historically, a lot of people will put you towards a deck like Kess. Maybe not as much now, but I think even now, I like to recommend Kess as like a good place to start, because it sort of has that backup ability where you can just do like the turbo thing. You ignore that you even have a commander. Yeah, you're casting your mana rocks and your rituals. You go for an early ad nause. And if that gets stopped, you're using your black tutors throughout the game and things like that. You get to redevelop with Kess and start to recast some of those resources and reuse them uh, to go later into the game. But in general, I would just say Grixis is a pretty nice place to start. And usually, when people mention Turbo, even just like in their mind, they're immediately thinking of like blue, black, red as what you're doing. Um, because just in getting into cEDH in general, turns out blue is really good. You've got a lot of counter magic, you've got Ristic Studies and Mystic Grimoires. It can really just make it easier on you when getting into it. You have a really tight win condition with Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation. Um, and you get access to Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze and LED. You really just get a lot of the good stuff cards. Um, and the issue kind of becomes or the learning curve is just understanding when you're supposed to go for it. So, for instance, really with any a turbo deck, like knowing if you should go for a turn one ad nauseum or a turn two ad nause, kind of reading the table, understanding like the resources that are in play. That's one of the big learning curves, because you'll find that when you goldfish a deck like this, it can be pretty easy. And I would highly recommend, if you're a new turbo player, to goldfish your decks a lot, because especially resolving ad nauseum. If it's not super easy to put the line together, if you have 15 mana left up after that, that's nice and easy. But sometimes it's like you really have to think about your lines, and so I would say typically more than like mid-range decks or stacks decks, you need like a good mechanical knowledge of like the actual moving pieces that you're going to be using, and getting in that play testing is really good. But just in general, I think blue helps make your life easier in cEDH. We both love Corvold, and I'm sure Eric is just dying to talk about Corvold. Um, the decks like Corvold are like the manual storm types of decks that have to put together more things, or are based on like their top decks. Like Corvold, being able to crack treasures and draw for Corvold is really nice, but there's a lot of skill there that once you get into piloting the deck, it can feel a little overwhelming. And so I think if you're brand new to cEDH, and especially if you haven't played Storm, going with something like a Kess or some other type of like Grixis deck. So like I think Rockside is a little tough to play. It is like one of maybe the best turbo deck right now, but it can be a little tough. If you don't mind the challenge, or and especially like if you've played Storm before, you're coming from Legacy or something like that, you can get in there with it. But just in general, some kind of flavor of Grixis, whether that's like Anala or Grixis Pirates with Malcolm and Vile Smasher, that's probably where I'd point you. Just because it makes your life a lot easier having access to the three best colors.
Yeah. So one thing that I really like about what you just said, you just mentioned Grixis Pirates, and I can use that as like a little anecdote here where that deck also kind of pivots into a mid-range deck. So there's like this interesting turbo deal where there's turbo decks that have the ability to turbo that could still do the turn one, but typically turn two, turn three ad nauseums, but that have this really great mid-range pivot plan or their mid-range with the ability to turbo ad nauseum or whatever those big powerful spells you want to play. So a great example to me is something like Najila. So
Mhm.
Najila, so if you look at kind of the current iteration of Najila, and this is where deck database kind of falls short because this particular deck list isn't out there on the database, and this isn't a slam against the database. This is just pure fact. But if you look at all the tournament scenes, I would venture to say 80+% of, if not more, I can tell you out of the last 10 to 15 lists that I've looked at Najila, from the tops have all been the kind of the NBC, and NBC stands for no bad cards. So, by the way, I saw a Rebel shirt that said NBC. I actually really want one of those. I think that's a pretty sweet top. But
That's definitely a good merch opportunity that I don't think she's seized on yet. Definitely just sell the NB top if you're listening to this Rebel, because people will buy it.
yeah, yeah, it's phenomenal. It like I saw it, I was like, that's pretty fire. I really like that a lot. I think that's what the kids still say today. I don't know what their slang is. I'm old, so you can see the gray hairs, but is something like Najila because Najila is very easy to get out, whether it's a turn one, turn two Najila. That's typically what you're trying to mulligan for, anyways. Even that falls in line with something like Teamer Malcolm, very similar thing. And you see these mid range elements of the deck, but in reality, what the deck is trying to do, it is trying to win or apply a win somewhere around the turns of 2 through 4. And when you see card decks like Najila or Teamer Malcolm, as an example, they play the extra time walk effect. So something like a Final Fortune, Warrior's Oath, Last Chance. Najila gets to play Chance for Glory, which is a instant speed one, which also gives your creatures indestructible, which is insane. And those let you take an additional turn, and then after this turn, if you don't win on your additional turn, you lose the game. But the goal is to win as fast as possible. And I think those time walk effects can also help identify what a true turbo deck is because they're trying to win in a particular turn order. So why give away the equity of that turn order to three other people when you can take it for yourself? So when I see decks like Najila, which can classify as like a turbo slash a mid range list, that kind of does the both roles because it can easily win with combat. In fact, that's like why combat really matters. Like that deck will know, especially that those do. But yeah, so like for me, my biggest suggestion, especially in CDH, we're extremely proxy friendly. If I could suggest anything, I would suggest playing Najila. That would be my first list for Turbo, just because of the ability to get it out super easy. Worst case scenario, you try to turn sideways. Math is for blockers. Or wait, is that right? Yeah, math is for blockers. Figure that out. But you also have your complicated lines with the ad nauseum and everything. And that's a really great tool to just kind of work through the different strategies as it has, especially if card selection and owning cards isn't a problem through us being really proxy friendly.
Spoiler alert: if you watch my top 5 decks for new players, Najila's number one on that list. I think nowadays we're at a point where a lot of the decks that are registering like ad nauseum that are in the 99 or 98, they're not turbo decks, and so there's like a lot of decisions. Like the people who want to play turbo, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too a little bit. Where you can go to Blue Farm, you can go to Najila, and some games you're gonna do like the turbo, turn two Nas thing to win, and you just have that really good backup pivot plan like Najila and Tim to have, where you can just like grind people out or win through combat damage or all these other things. I think in general, um, where I'm less likely to recommend people go to those decks is because the pivot plan can be a bit overwhelming because I think those decks are good because they can do that. And if you're not like familiarity with the 99 of Najila is going to be super rewarding for you in general. Like knowing when and how you're able to say like, okay, I was going to go for the Underworld Breach thing, but I think now I should go for Derevi. Or okay, I have half of Thoracle, but maybe I don't go for it now, and we're just going to try to get Grim Hireling. Like being able to know all of that really is going to be super rewarding. And if that idea of like pivoting between game plans is really appealing for you, and having the ability to just say like turn one Doric Pass or like turn one Tinder Wall, sack it for 2 red, dockside into blah 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 blah. Being having that flexibility, if that's not intimidating for you, it's going to be really helpful to stick with Najila because that's not a deck that's going anywhere. And recently, it's just been getting better and better as people have experimented with it and moved towards the more turbo style with it.
Yeah, and just the cards that they're printing, as of late, are just really, really helping the deck out because there's a lot of these early drop creatures that just provide like so much value that also help pivot like your game plan. Like we were just talking about off air, Archivist of Ogma being a two body with flash, being able to sneak it in, surprise block somebody, but also the fact that it's crazy because you can like have your turn one acceleration leave up if you need to counterspell something. If nothing happens, you flash in the Ogma so you don't lose that equity. You untap, you cast Najila, and you're off to the races. And just having cards like that just really, really help and reward these style of decks because it still allows them to apply speed and pressure, but also still take advantage of running cards that are interactive on top of the stack. So something like, counter spells, for example. So it's really tough to just kind of like specifically solidify like turbo mid-range stacks when like some of these decks kind of all layer in. And even with the turbo decks, there's still stacks there's still stacks creatures in all these decks. It doesn't define that deck as stacks, but it still has that element. And that's just cards are good. Like magic cards are insanely good now. Like you're gonna see Drannith Magistrate in a ton of decks that can play it. Same with Ranger Captain of Eos. A turbo deck still that has white, still gonna play Ranger Captain. Ranger Captain is a mid-range card. It also essentially is like some form of stacks on the board. So yeah, yeah, magic cards are good. Wizards needs to print
Yeah,
better green cards, but
we're definitely in a point right now specifically where like 4 colors or more is just the best thing you can do. It seems like in a lot of ways. Maybe people don't like that opinion. If you're not doing something really broken like Winota, lets you like we mentioned. Winota is a really good example because it's a deck that runs a lot of stacks pieces. It can turbo them out, and it has the greatest, in my opinion, like the greatest value engine in the command zone. So it's like a reason you see a deck like that do so well is because it is a stack C bid range deck that turbos out stacks. It's doing literally all three of these things, and depending on the game plan, you can pivot between them. And that's really just like the name of the game right now, at least in tournament cEDH, is like pivoting with your game plan, having the ability to do the mid range grindy thing or the turbo thing. And yeah, that's really where we're at, especially with the ad nauseum style of turbo decks.
Oh yeah, and just like especially with Oda, just being able to basically break parity on its own stacked pieces that would possibly affect it. And it breaks kind of the fundamental rules of Magic. It gives you like weird randomization card selection. So it's so because you don't know what's on top of your deck. So it the game plan never feels the same. It's just doing a lot of it because of all the triggers and stuff that it gets. And for whatever reason, they just keep producing these one drops with haste in every set. So it just makes it get better and better with randomly evasion. So I think there's like a 1 mana 1/1 flying like creature or something like that. It's got like haste or something. I don't know. Something ridiculous. I'm pretty sure they printed that just really helps that game plan around. And if you really look at that deck inherently, like it's got a lot of poor quality cards in it. Like like these like random like double striking cards and stuff like that that you look at and you're like, man, this isn't what I really want to do. And these cards don't feel inherently powerful, but in within that shell and what that shell's trying to do, when you put a like a 5 or 6 or 7 mana card into play for free, that's broken. So it's really it's really the true show and tell, this true show and tell deck without running blue. But yeah, so a deck like that is just inherently, and also a lot of probably mislabeled. I think it gets mislabeled a lot. It's like, and I don't think it's inherent. I just don't think people really do a lot of like thought provoking, like, experiments on that. They're just like, oh, Winona stacks. But in reality, because I think that's like maybe what it's called, but in reality, it is a deck that literally cheats and breaks the fundamental rules of the game.
Yeah, which it turns out is a little bit of a trend. The more your deck can do that kind of stuff where you're cheating, basically, turns out it's very powerful. We don't want to get too sidetracked on Winota though. We got to talk about turbo stuff. So I think what could be really helpful is just when getting into turbo, we talked about how you can have a lot of sort of complexities with managing your resources, knowing when to go for it, when not to. So yeah, if you guys don't know, Eric is he has one of the primers on the database for Corvold, the Mad King, um, and is just a turbo head in general. So going over to you, what are some tips you would give for some of these beginner players who are looking to get started with a more dedicated sort of turbo deck that's probably looking to do more of the stormy kind of game plan that you might see with some of these decks?
So what I would like to do is first I like to just get familiar with the deck and understand what all the cards do. So if there's a resource out there that provides a primer on a deck that you're interested in, I would absolutely read the primer. I would reach out to the author, and then any other the people that are out there. They don't have to be the top head of the community in terms of content creators or anything like that. It doesn't necessarily exclude them, but I would just reach out to anybody that is very knowledgeable in the deck or has a big passion about it, because you're going to be able to open your eyes up to some stuff. And I would also like to really think about, so when I sit down at a table, I understand what decks that are there. I like to look at what seed order I'm in and what type of game plan am I going to do based on what that. So I'll just use Corvold, for example, because it's the easiest one, because that's what we're talking about. The best thing to do is just understand what your role and what you're trying to accomplish. Based on that, if I'm trying to be really, really fast, I still think patience is a fundamental part. I was just in a tournament yesterday, and had I just been a little bit more patient, I could have easily just powered through a collector oof. But instead, I over respected the table, especially because I had two blue players at the table. And I just thought I needed to get my ad nauseum online as fast as possible. In reality, it kind of punished me instead of being able to hold up my vampiric tutor for letting a whole turn order around. So like I had to judge like what's more important, the equity of the blue players drawing one additional card or just seeing what the table should have done. So I think patience is something that all of us turbo heads can still practice. And once you have the patience, I think you have a greater agency over the game. And then that's the thing that I've noticed about in the history of Magic, fast, powerful decks that just have that small pivot point or just the right amount of interaction to push through their combos typically are always the top of the meta. When you see like a Charbelcher deck that can run disruption, Charbelcher deck will be the best, or just that's just an example, or a Storm turbo deck that has just the right amount of disruption. And that's why you see a lot of these powerful turbo decks still being able to play cards like Silence or Silence like effects, or Silence on creatures, or even Veil of Summer and the cards that are very similar to it. So patience is really important. Just being able to understand what happens in the cost ratio of going for it and how to rebuild if you don't succeed. And sometimes you don't, and that's okay, because that's also the price to pay for playing a deck with that much power. Being able to loop something or traditionally bring back something like Dockside Extortionist. Or is this going to have to be, and one thing that Corvold does really well, it has Corvold in the command zone. So if I'm not trying to power out, that's actually a great segue point. Is this a Corvold game or an ad nauseum game? If you figure out which game it is, then you're going to be able to like lean into the other, which is really awesome because you're going to have the resources at that point. Because if it is ad nauseum resolves, you can do whatever you can probably do whatever you want outside of being silenced by your opponent. But if it's a Corvold plan and I'm trying to put a Corvold online, that means I need to have a resource heavy hand because Corvold's going to be eating my resources to trade off for drawing those cards. So understanding those two pivot points actually will teach you a lot about the deck. And honestly, playing with your friends, going into that, try both, even in like pods that you don't inherently feel like, so you kind of know like, okay, I'm not trying to play a Corvold game and this super turbo ad nauseum like mill. I need to try to get my ad nauseum on as fast as possible, or vice versa. If I'm in a grind fest and I've got Brassios X, this Abzan list over here, and then some other collector oof style deck over there, I should probably mulligan for a hand that has like maybe a dockside into like a turn two Corvold. And then that way I can pivot off of that and build my resources and try to, map out a game plan based on that.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a big thing to, in general, like moving from like the gold fishing stage of learning the deck and then getting into real games. A really big part of that is knowing your game plan, whether that's, if you're in a deck that can pivot between different game plans, knowing when to implement one or the other, or like you mentioned, just knowing when to go for it can be key. A lot of times you think it's open and this is the only chance I'm going to get, but especially if you take a look around, you realize like, okay, the game's getting slowed down. For someone to be able to win, they're going to have to deal with some of this, and knowing like when that moment is that you actually is the best moment. It's usually like, annoyingly, it's usually the time right after you're going to do it, because you think like, oh, okay, this is the best chance. You go for it, you get countered, and then someone else goes for it, and it turns out that was the one counter spell. So if you just let them do it first, I think turbo, especially, the person who goes for it first is often the one who gets stopped. And then if you're able to just pick up right after them and go for it, you're able to get in there. But yeah, in general, I would say what helped me a lot was that gold fishing process is super helpful. Learning, reading the primer, like Eric said, watching gameplay can be really helpful. Like seeing the deck in action, reading about it. But then after you do sort of the homework of, doing all that, playing the deck, in like a goldfish testing, really trying to get the mechanics of it so that when you get into a game, you're not wasting, everybody's time or whatever, or feeling like you are. After that, you just really need to jam games, especially into pods that aren't favorable and where you feel like you're going to be nervous at first. But I especially found like going into games, is it really is what actually helps you, because like you said, the rest of it is kind of just gold fishing. Once you get to the point where you're winning, once you resolve the Nas or the Pier, a lot of that you could just do on your own and play solitaire. But the real hard part that you're only going to get better at is knowing when to go for it, knowing what your position is in the game. Am I the fastest deck? Am I the second fastest deck? Third fastest? Because that really changes a lot of the dynamics, of knowing when to go for something, knowing how the decks at the table disrupt you. A lot of that is the tough part, and you're only going to get that just throwing yourself into games that you might lose. I really beat myself up first getting into Corvold. I would purposely pull up Corvold into like stupid Rurikthar and Yasharn, which is just like literally like the worst possible matchup for a deck like Corvold. But just going into that, and like you have to kind of take your licks and find where the deck struggles that you're playing, and where it's good, and just that sort of pacing that you got to keep up in a game, and just getting a lot of games in is really the only way you can do that.
Yeah. And honestly, people, we get caught up in our win loss percentage. And that's the thing that I really wouldn't focus on, especially learning. I would just literally look at it as learning experience. It's been a while since I've like been in true tournament magic. Really honestly, probably since like 2020 during like, the shutdown and all that fun stuff. So like getting back into like true set down time regulated tournament play and just being able to like kind of slow the pace down of the day and just making sure you're prepared for the event. I think that's really important, especially too if like you're have that control over yourself and making sure you're well slept, hydrated, properly fed, playing a turbo deck, you're just going to be at flow and those type of things. We don't really, that doesn't really get touched up a lot on playing magic. I think I think we kind of focus on the deck, but the person at hand, and also too just understanding like your play style and what you enjoy too. Like, do I like the all in, Rogrek style decks? And I'll be honest with you, like I like the it's really cool when it pops off. Roger Salas is like just looks blisteringly fast. But like I personally would probably enjoy playing the Gila a lot more versus that, which I have, like so being able to have played all these decks, like, I kind of know what my style is, and what it can do. Now if they print, Silas Wren that draws a card, like whenever it deals damage or something like that, that's a totally different subject. Now we're talking, or just like on attack or something crazy like that. Just like a just super OP like blue black partner for Roger, which would just be hilarious. But getting back to the point of just, using those experiences and don't getting caught up in those results and just experimenting, especially too, because ultimately we're just trying to create a better like play environment, especially with your friends. Like I like to like jam like different decks into pods that, like you said, that are very unfavorable and just different variations of that deck. It might be a 5 to 10 card package I'll change in and out, really helps out. Like, okay, so like, okay, this version of Corvold is better in like a Grixis Turbo meta, or this version of Corvold's better in more of a Thrasios meta. What does that look like for each of those? And what could I give to a player? Because my database deck is never fully representative of what I play. It's for the general audience. That's what I actually how I built my deck, which is pretty interesting because a lot of people use the database as like a tier structure. Like this particular version of this deck is on the database, and that therefore it is the best version of it. And that is not accurate at all, as we've seen, the Roger decks that do really well, the Nagila decks that do really well, the Temnocrom decks that do really well. Those aren't inherently on the database. So that's not true representation. It's the players in the community that are in these discords, that are in these play groups, that are actually out playing the tournaments. They're the ones that are actually providing the better versions of the list because they're the ones that are inactive. And some of the lists do, like we see like Don Wicker Thrasios, it gets regularly updated by its author. Shout out to Ian and stuff, but which is phenomenal for that. So like Ian's a rare breed to me in that regard to like Winona and Don Wicker Thrasios. But like we're not necessarily seeing some of these primer authors and who are in tournament play with the deck keeping up with it, and again, that's why I feel like the database inherently is shortcoming, even with somebody myself who's on it. So that's why I want to provide a better resource of my primer that actually has the other options in there as well, with a full on primer of how to play each variation of the deck, links to the decks, and what to expect. So as a new player, I like to try to absorb, because I was a new CDH player, so I like to jump in and try to absorb as much knowledge as possible about these lists and just kind of get in there and test it out, especially with Turbo. And if you don't, especially if you don't have a lot of Magic background, if you've ever played, like if you're like an old school Magic player, or even like the last 5-6 years, you've probably played some variation of like a fast deck. So now you got to apply that type of knowledge to what it means to be fast in cEDH, especially in a quote turbo setting.
Yeah, I think with a lot of that, and just in general, and this section of this series is really about not just understanding what these types of decks do and these archetypes, but being able to find where your space is in cEDH, what you're going to enjoy, what's going to resonate with you. And that applies to both like choosing a deck in general, like Eric said, like if you decide, oh, I really love Corvold, knowing that and then loving Turbo, but then also, being able to make the card choices that you want to be able to make. You swap things out as you see fit because, like he was saying, a lot of times the deck that you just immediately find or it's on the database isn't really going to fit either your play style or your preferences or what you're finding yourself playing against. And so, just in general, being able to just get some games in, be able to like learn what these archetypes look like and understand deck lists. Yeah, I find that you'll as you play more, you'll and learn more about cEDH, you'll be able to just like look at a deck list and be able to just say like, oh, okay, I like this, I like this. I don't really like what they're doing there, and then just be able to get a feel for it a lot more, and it'll be a lot quicker. It won't be like you know the very first time you jump into cEDH is going to be like the most overwhelmed you are. It's going to get a lot easier to figure out, and then you start to see these staples. Like if you listen to the last episode where we go over a lot of the staples, just knowing a lot of those cards already is going to help you kind of figure out what you want to do. But yeah, just jam these decks, and then if you maybe turbo isn't for you, maybe you like going fast, but if you don't like the very all in, sort of hey, if I get countered once I might be screwed type of thing, then maybe you'll enjoy mid range or stacks more, and you're just gonna have to get some games in to find it out. I definitely recommend if you think, hey, I'm a dedicated stacks player, try out all the archetypes. For me, I love just trying out decks in general. Just anything I can play just to try to get the learning experience in. I enjoy getting to do that. And that's the best way to learn other than listening to this amazing podcast, Learning CDH. But yeah, you just gotta get in there and try out all these different things and just see what sticks with you and what doesn't.
Yeah, and just be open. Be open to learning, being open to pivot, and going fast doesn't always necessarily mean you know, dumping your hand on turn 2. Going fast could just mean putting your commander out, really early that also accrues advantage. I turn 2 Crom's pretty good, so
Turns out, real quick before we get out of here, I was reached out to by the CDH Portuguese League. They're going to be running their 10th tournament over there in May, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. They have $2,000 in prizes. It sounds like a really sick event. I wish that I could go, but
does.
I am about as far from Portugal as you can get. But yeah, if you happen to be there, make sure to check it out. We're going to be talking about it over a couple other episodes as we get closer to it. But yeah, if you're there, it's going to be sick. Going to tournaments in general is awesome if you can make it to any of them and support the people who run them. That's awesome to do. But yeah, thank you so much for listening or watching us. If you enjoy this, comment, tell us what you like, tell us what you want to get that's different. Subscribe, follow us, and rate us over on Spotify or wherever else we might be. If you like this content, you can support us over on Patreon to get it even earlier. There should be some Patreon exclusive content coming in the next few months, mainly with gameplay, stuff like that. And yeah, thank you for watching. See you next time.